How about it, Wally? Do the brakes act the way Mr. Rogers said?
They're unusual, George. Sometimes they grab and sometimes they don't. But that's not all. Look here. See how far I got to push the brakes down to get any action? See? There's not much pedal left.
Well, what does that mean? One wheel's getting most of the fluid, so there's not enough left for the other one?
George, you ought to know better than that.
Hey, you, Wally, quit bawling George out. He's me pal. Besides, like I was telling a fellow yesterday, you gotta give a man the inside dope on hydraulic brakes before you start showing him how to fix them.
Right again, Tex. Come on over to the wash rack and I'll show you both something about hydraulic brakes. See how all the fingers of this rubber glove are pushed up when I start squeezing the water out of the palm? The important thing is that all four get the same amount of pressure.
That's okay, Wally. It shows one of the most important things about hydraulic brakes, that you automatically get the same pressure at all four wheels when you push down on the brake pedal.
Right. So if you had a pressure of, say, 100 pounds per square inch at the master cylinder, you'd have 100 pounds per square inch at each wheel cylinder. Let's see what that means in braking power. To make it simple, let's say that the piston in the master cylinder and the pistons in all the wheel cylinders each had 1 square inch of surface. And suppose we put 100 pounds of pressure on the master cylinder piston. Then we'd have 100 pounds at each wheel piston. With 8 pistons, that means 8 times 100 pounds, or 800 pounds of force working to stop the car.
Don't let Wally kid you. The arithmetic of the brake system ain't that simple. But it's just as though one man pushing on the brake pedal makes 8 men push on the brakes, 1 at each shoe.
To see how the brake system actually works, let's start with the master cylinder. You can see by this cutaway view, at the bottom we have the cylinder itself with a piston that pushes fluid out of the cylinder when you step on the brake pedal. That spring moves the piston back. Then, above the cylinder, there's a space for reserve fluid. That's so the cylinder is always supplied with fluid.
Notice them 2 holes in the bottom of the reservoir, George? They're mighty important.
That's right, Tex. Between the 2 of them, they see to it that the cylinder never has too little or too much fluid. You'll see just how, George, as we go along.
Let's see. Is this where the pedal connects?
Yes, that's the push rod that operates the piston. The rubber boot around it keeps the dirt and water out. The boot collar fits against this plate that closes the cylinder floor and acts as the stop for the piston. Notice that the piston's shaped so it's surrounded by fluid. This rubber cup in the groove in the piston keeps the fluid in and the air out. It's called the secondary cup. This other cup is the primary cup. That's the one that pushes the fluid out of the cylinder and into the lines. When the brakes are off, like this shows, this big return spring holds the primary cup in place against the piston. At the end of the cylinder, the spring holds a valve assembly against the end plug where the lines to the wheels are connected.
You mean to say there's a valve in the master cylinder?
Sure, George. And it's a very special kind of valve. Fluid going out of the cylinder goes through the middle, past the valve. But coming back the other way, it has to push the whole assembly back and go round the edge. You'll see in a minute.
Suppose we take it step by step to see exactly what happens.
Okay. I'm stepping on the brake pedal. Of course, that moves the push rod.
And the rod shoves the piston against the fluid in the master cylinder. The primary cup spreads out to make a tight seal, so the fluid moves too. Of course, moving the piston also compresses the big return spring. The small spring on the valve can't hold against the pressure of the fluid, so the valve is pushed open, like this. That lets some of the fluid move out of the master cylinder into the lines. Because the lines are already full, The fluid coming out of the master cylinder moves the whole column ahead of it. The end of the line is at the wheel cylinder. So, pushing the fluid forces it against the pistons in the wheel cylinders, moving them out. That moves the brake shoes. So the final step in the process is when the shoes contact the brake drums and slow the wheel till the car comes to a stop.
Well, that's not too complicated. But now what happens when you take your foot off the pedal?
That's when things really happen fast. Everything goes into reverse all along the line, and a lot of things happen at once.
That's right. In the master cylinder, the return spring slides the piston back to its original position as soon as you take your foot off the pedal. At the same time, the return springs on the brake shoes pull them away from the drums. This movement shoves the pistons in the wheel cylinder back, which forces the fluid back into the lines. So, now the pressure's in the other direction, from all the wheel cylinders back to the master cylinder. But the returning fluid can't fill up the master cylinder as fast as its piston slides back. So, just for an instant, pressure in the primary chamber ahead of the piston is reduced. That causes fluid under atmospheric pressure in the secondary chamber around the piston to flow into the primary chamber.
Well, how does it get past the cup?
Well, you see, there are 6 small holes drilled in the master cylinder piston. On the pressure stroke, the brass washer keeps the cup from being forced into the holes. But on the return stroke, fluid passing through the holes moves the washer away and forces the lip of the cup away from the cylinder wall so it fills up the primary chamber.
Here's where that large hole in the reservoir goes to work. It lets fluid come down around the piston as fast as it goes past the cup into the primary chamber.
But what about the fluid that's coming back through the lines?
Why, it pushes the valve assembly off its seat and pours into the cylinder.
Then we got more fluid coming into the cylinder than we started out with, huh?
Right. That's why the small hole. It lets extra fluid go back to the reservoir.
Now tell me one thing more. Just when does that valve at the end of the master cylinder go back on its seat again?
That's a good question, George. The valve gets pushed back on its seat by the piston return spring. So that means the valve closes as soon as the fluid in the lines can't push harder than the spring. The spring is stiff enough so that when it shuts off the flow, the fluid in the lines is still under a pressure of about 10 pounds. That gives you a head start next time you need the brakes.
Boy, between you and Tech, I sure have a better idea of how hydraulic brakes work. But I've got still another question for you.
Can you save it, kid? If this record isn't turned over pretty soon, we won't be able to hear a word you say. Now, what's that big question you got, George?
Well, Tech, how come the front brakes got 2 separate cylinders?
Because when you stop, the forward motion shifts better than half the weight onto the front wheels. So you need 60% of the braking right there. But hydraulic pressure is equal throughout the system. So to get more braking on the front wheels without increasing pedal pressure, the anchors are located so both shoes are drawn into the drum.
You see, George, as soon as the lining contacts the drum, the forward rotation of the wheel itself tends to pull both front wheel brake shoes in closer to the drum. That's how you got more braking at the front than at the rear, even though the hydraulic pressure is the same all around. Uh-oh, here comes the boss.
Sounds like you're getting some good background, George.
Sure am, Dave. So far, I've learned how these hydraulic brakes work. But how about some of the things that can go wrong?
Well, let's start with the master cylinder. You'll have lost brakes if the relief port is plugged with dirt, or if the piston doesn't come back far enough to clear the relief port. In either case, the fluid can't return to the reservoir. Rust or corrosion at the end of the cylinder, which prevents the piston from coming back all the way, can be cleaned out by honing. Another thing that can prevent full return of the piston is the improper setting of the push rod. Ordinarily, that shouldn't be changed. But if you find the brake pedal doesn't have 1/8 to a 1/4 inch of free play before the push rod contacts the piston, you'll have to shorten the push rod. That'll let the piston come back farther.
Well, how about dirt?
That's right. Dirt cuts the cups, and it only takes a little to make them leak. Never use fluid you're not sure of. The wrong fluid makes the rubber cups swell up and stick. and can also ruin the flexible hoses.
Always keep your brake fluid in sealed cans so it can't absorb moisture.
Isn't brake fluid all alike?
Heck no, George. Never mix brands. Always use the kind that's recommended for the car.
But suppose there was wrong fluid in there already.
You'd drain it out, then flush it. Replace the parts and refill the whole system with Mopar's Super Brake Fluid.
I know air in the lines is another cause of trouble. But just what does it do?
Two things. First, when you step on the brake pedal, you waste part of your pressure just compressing the air. Second, it takes longer for your brakes to act. So you have a spongy pedal, sort of like stepping on a rubber ball. You have to bleed the system to get the air out.
Couldn't that also come from a leak somewhere?
Sure. If the pedal goes down to the floor and you know the brakes are adjusted, you can be sure it's a leak. So, you check the fluid level in the master cylinder.
Before you take that plug out, first get all the dirt off. A lot of perfectly good brake systems are ruined by some guy just not bothering to clean the dirt off that plug.
Where would you look for leaks, Dave?
First, check the end plug on the master cylinder. Then all the lines and connections throughout the system. You can peel back the boots on the wheel cylinders, too, to check leaks there. If you don't find any leaks, fill up the master cylinder and pump the pedal to see if anything shows up under pressure.
Could you have enough fluid but not enough pressure?
Yes, if the primary cup's worn or the cylinder's scored. That lets fluid bypass, so you lose pressure. You'd have to disassemble the master cylinder for a complete inspection. Well, let's get on over with Wally. I see he's got a wheel off. The work order on this job says the brakes are uneven. Sometimes the car pulls to one side. What have you found so far, Wally?
Well, of course, first thing I did was pull the wheel. Then I found that fluid had soaked into the lining. It can't be cleaned off, George, and it's one of the things that'll make your brakes grab. Here's the leak right at the cylinder. Fluid is pushed past the piston and piled up behind the boot till it's forced its way out and down onto the shoes and drum.
Okay. Let's get that cylinder apart and see what's wrong.
Just one thing, Tech. George, before we start, put this block under the foot pedal so we won't be squirting fluid all over the place. The shoes come right off when we disconnect the return springs. Slip the washers off the anchor bolts and remove the retainers and guide springs. Next, we peel off the boot and take out the piston and spring.
If they stick, George, you could get them out by carefully bumping the pedal. See these grooves in the side of the cup? That's where the fluid leaked out.
Well, that shows you what harm dirt in the system can do.
Gee, how do you suppose dirt got into this job?
Well, a number of ways, George. First, it might be due to dirt on replacement parts. Second, dirt might get past an improperly installed boot. A third way would be handling fluid in dirty cans. And fourth, if you didn't wipe the dirt off that filler plug, it could fall into the reservoir. A good mechanic's on the ball right down to keeping his hands clean.
What if that dirt had scored the wheel cylinder?
Well, if they were just light scratches, we could probably clean them up with crocus cloth. If they were deeper, or if we had rust or corrosion, we might have to hone the cylinder or replace it. Any of the cylinders can be honed right on the car, but be careful not to take out more than 0.04 of an inch.
How do you clean that honing dust out, Wally?
First, I squirt some alcohol in and wipe it dry with a cloth that doesn't leave any lint. Then another shot of alcohol. Then, with the air hose, get rid of the alcohol so it can't damage the rubber parts or dilute the fluid. After that, flush out the cylinder with new fluid.
We know we've got dirt in the system, Wally, so just to be sure, we'd better flush the whole thing.
Right. George, if you'll bring me some new cups and boots out of stock, we'll finish up with the wheel cylinders.
Watch those cups, kid. The ones for the outside wheel cylinders look like the secondary cup in the master cylinder, but they're stiffer and haven't any shoulders.
Thanks for the tip, Ted.
Glad you mentioned that, Tech. Those cups do look alike. But you sure can't switch them or you'll be in trouble all around. Oh, thanks, George. Those are the right ones. These new boots will keep dirt or water out. Now, we make sure all the parts are perfectly clean. Dip them in brake fluid to lubricate them, and then put them together. Be sure the large end of the return spring is toward the piston. Now, George, whenever you open the system, air always gets in, so you have to get it out by bleeding. You can't tell where the air in the lines may be trapped, so we'll bleed all four wheels, starting with the right rear, which has the longest line.
On the front wheels, you bleed the bottom cylinder first to keep air from getting trapped in the short line between the two cylinders. And before you start, be sure you back off the shoe adjusting cam.
It's best to use the pressure bleeder tank rather than pump the fluid through with the brake pedal. It's faster and takes only one man, and it forces all the air out of the system. But don't let the pressure in the tank go over 15 pounds. If you do, the fluid starts to take in air.
Speaking about getting all the air out, there's a new technique to bleeding brakes in this reference book. Be sure you read it.
After you bleed all the lines, the job's done, huh?
Heck no, George. You've got to readjust the shoe cams. And like I've always been telling you, no job is done until you've taken it out on the road so you know it's fixed.
Right as usual, Tex. That your last word this time?
Well, almost. Except I got an angle I want to leave with all the boys. Remember, fellas, when you're working on brakes, you can't be too careful, because somebody's life depends on you.